Dear friends, I'm honored to speak today at the Belgrade Security Conference. This conference is about security, but security and democracy cannot be separated. Without democracy, there is no real security. Democratic countries don't start wars. They don't use migrants as weapons or threaten the world with nuclear arms. They don't hijack planes, jail journalists, or crush their own people. This is what authoritarian regimes do, whether in Belarus, Russia, or anywhere else. As I travel across Europe, I see that many, especially the younger generation, don't fully understand the value of democracy. For them, it has become an annoying buzzword. When you live in freedom, it feels like air, taken for granted. But only when you lose it, do you start to suffocate. As a result, people are tempted by populists, drawn to easy answers for complex problems. This weakens democracy, and in the end, it weakens security. Belarus is a living example of what happens when democracy is lost. When dictatorship goes unpunished, it becomes a threat not only to its own people, but to all its neighbors. First, Lukashenko stole elections, destroyed the media, silenced the courts, and jailed his opponents. Then he dragged Belarus into war, stationed nuclear weapons on our soil, and holds 9 million Belarusians hostages. Lukashenko was on the brink of collapse just a few years ago. He survived only because of Putin's support. Now he repays his debt with Belarus sovereignty. And those brave enough to speak out are imprisoned, exiled, or silenced. This is not much different from Stalin's time. Thousands of political prisoners remain in Belarusian jails today. Among them is my husband, who has been held incommunicado for nearly 2 years. I even don't know if he is alive. Dictators like Lukashenko can spread fear, but they cannot force people to love or accept them. All these repressions has not crushed the spirit of Belarusians. Inside Belarus, resistance continues underground. Outside, in exile, we have built alternative democratic institutions of power, like United Transitional Cabinet or Coordination Council. We are preparing for the moment when change will come. I know our Belarusian struggle resonates here in the Balkans. Even in the darkest times, you didn't lose hope. You continue to fight for justice, for freedom. Belarusians are doing the same today. You know how fragile peace can be when democracy is weak. Our region has been scared by wars and by leaders who put power above people. Lukashenko once praised Milosevic as a strong leader, but we all know how Milosevic's story ended. Just recently, together with Lithuania, we submitted a case to the International Criminal Court against Lukashenko. We ask other countries to endorse it too. Let this be a warning to those who think they can rule with impunity. Dictators will face justice. The fight against tyranny is not local, it is global. Authoritarian leaders learn from each other. They share tactics, propaganda, disinformation, and repression. So we must learn from each other too. Government, civil society, and activists must work together to strengthen democracy and resist authoritarianism. Strong civil society and free media are key to this fight. Free media doesn't just inform, it holds power to account and protects democracy. For example, Belarusian journalists are working with networks like OCCRP to expose corruption and disinformation. I invite civil society organizations in this room to make joint projects and partnerships with Belarusians, organize events and campaigns, expert discussions and exchanges. We need more understanding between the Balkans and Belarus. So let's share the experience and inspire each other. To government representatives, I invite to establish relationship and formal cooperation. Work with democratic Belarus, not usurper who seized power. In the fight against tyranny, we need allies. For us, the European Union is more than an economic alliance. It's a stronghold of values, freedom, democracy, and human rights. And it must stay open to all who believe in these principles: the Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and one day Belarus. For us Belarusians, Europe is the only viable alternative to the Russian world. Sometimes I fear that Belarus could be sacrificed in a post-war deal, offered as a consolation prize to Putin. And it must not happen. And we will never agree to give up our independence or our European future. And I know that you share this feeling. We must reject tyranny and dictatorship wherever it appears. We must not let dictators misuse international organizations for their own gain. Andrei Gnyot spent a year under arrest here in Belgrade because Lukashenko used Interpol against him. And I thank the Serbian leadership for deciding not to extradite him. Thanks to diplomats and civil society for campaigning for his release. We must help Ukraine win the war, because this fight in Ukraine, in Belarus, is not about territory. It's a fight for values. We must reject the idea that dictators can be appeased or re-educated. We must be guided by our moral compass, not just by short-term interests. Dictators don't stop until we stop them. If we want lasting peace, we must build strong democracies in our homes. Dear friends, Belarus shows what happens when democracy is lost. It makes clear why democracy must be defended everywhere, in the Balkans or in Belarus. And together we can ensure a Europe that is whole, free and secure. So let us fight for a future where no dictator can threaten freedom again. Long live Belarus, long live Europe. Dear friends, I'm honored to speak today at the Belgrade Security Conference. This conference is...
Here we are again. Good morning, and a very warm welcome also from my side to all of you, to our panelists, in the context of this conversation that we are going to have this very morning about war and democracy, political developments in Eastern Europe in light of Russian aggression, a panel that is co-sponsored by an international research project called Redemos, coordinated in Norway by the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, revolving around EU and EU member states' democracy support action in Eastern Europe. I would like to begin this conversation first and foremost by extending my most sincere gratitude to the President-elect of Belarus, and by extension her very competent team, for having agreed to be part of, even though indirectly and not in person, unfortunately, this conversation this very morning, as I think that this, on one hand, very touching, but on the other hand, also very pertinent message on the part of the President-elect is important in at least three regards. One, I think it serves as a very important reminder to not, as the President-elect said herself, forget about the plight of Belarusians and Belarusians' political future. A development that unfortunately is happening all too often these days in policy circles, even in scholarly communities. Just look into the mission letter, for example, by Commission President von der Leyen to the Commissioner Designate for Enlargement, Marta Kos. It doesn't even mention Belarus. Second, I think the talk, the address by the President-elect brings us back to what we have been discussing yesterday in one of the panels on the Middle East, this issue of intersectionality. In this case, the intersectionality between, on one hand, war, on the other hand, democracy and political development, and of course, the linkage, the intersectionality between political development in, say, Georgia and Moldova, and how this has repercussions in Ukraine and vice versa. And thirdly, to paraphrase the President-elect, I think there are a couple of very important points that she mentioned that will inform our conversation over the next 50 minutes. One of which, and again, to paraphrase, is freedom is like air. You take it for granted, and only when it's being taken away from you, you feel it. You start suffocating. By extension, the same could be said about political liberties, civic rights, when they're being eroded. The same can be said about the rule of law when it is being undermined and perverted. The same goes for regimes ignoring social justice. In other words, all these foundations, parameters, if you wish, of what constitutes a functioning democracy, if these parameters are being eroded, you start suffocating, to paraphrase the president-elect. And this again informs our conversation, which revolves basically around two major questions. How has democracy, democratic development fared in at least the three countries we are going to discuss this morning, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, over the past 1,001 days, I should say? And what can we do to make EU democracy support, but also EU member states and by extension Western democracy support action in Eastern Europe more effective, more tangible, more resilient? I don't want to monopolize this conversation and raise my first question maybe to you, Adrian and Giorgi, so our colleagues from Moldova and Georgia. You held presidential elections just very recently, 2 rounds. You had a constitutional EU membership referendum. Georgia witnessed legislative elections on the 26th of October. What these processes have in common was a massive external interference, i.e. Russian meddling in these electoral processes. Can you bring us maybe up to speed as to how this interference has really played out on election day, election days, so to speak, but also in the run-up to this? And could we in any way, and I know this is difficult to quantify, of course, do we have an idea maybe of what the results would have looked like had there not been any meddling domestically? Maybe Adrian, you want to go first?
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Indeed, Moldova, in the presidential elections that we held this month, October and November, withstanded the biggest attack on democratic exercise, on the core democratic exercise, which is an election. Moldovan police forces have documented 130,000 cases of voters' buyout, because it happened through a Russian sanctioned bank, Provincial Bank, where 130,000 people received notification of their balance being filled with money and received instruction on how to vote based on that payout. And the phenomena that happened in a run-up to this was constant and increased weaponization of the democratic or anti-democratic measures in democratic exercises, such as collecting people's data in an illegal way, such as creating and developing a party, not like a party with all the democratic structure and democratic funding, but like a criminal group, and distorting the narratives using an incredible amount of resources filled in fueling propaganda and disinformation. So what we witnessed in these presidential elections and constitutional referendum was an never seen before, if I may say, evolution of hybrid warfare, because everyone prepared in the past several years and set ourselves on the idea that hybrid warfare is mainly about the disinformation, and it's no longer the case. It's weaponization of controlled political parties from the abroad, and it's direct voter buyout. That is extremely dangerous, because if that is to be replicated in the future, not only in Moldova but across the region, that will distort the fundamental of a democracy, the free and fair election, and a perspective that those who are elected based on genuine people ask for something in the society, and we will get to a point where election will be an exercise bought and sold. So that's the up to speed and an unfortunate one. The good element is that we saw, on the other hand, in Moldovan election, an unprecedented mobilization of citizens who fought this. So against all odds, against a massive infuse of money and resources from abroad in Moldovan, to distort Moldovan electoral campaign, there was a massive win for democracy on people mobilizing, getting out to vote, and succeeding in defending their option of a pro-European country and of a pro-European path.
Thank you. Giorgi, to Georgia.
Just to set the background for Georgia, just to understand the reality in Georgia, we need to take into account these two important factors. The one is that we're experiencing, I would say, a textbook example of state capture in Georgia, where all state institutions are being captured by the ruling party. There is no state institution that can withstand the influence of the ruling party. And at the same time, and obviously there is this one man behind the ruling party, the former prime minister, the richest man in the country, whose net worth is around 30% of Georgia's GDP, 30. So there is no one who can compete with him. And then that we have the population, the second factor, who is, I mean, in its absolute majority pro-Western and pro-European. So against that background, now moving to the question that you asked, Tobias, in our case, we have a completely different situation in the way that in Moldova, the government and the people fought against the Russian interference. In Georgia, the government and Russia are in the same team. And it is people who are countering that with whatever we can. So we saw, I mean, unprecedented level of election manipulations, and I'll be happy to expand on that later on. We've seen the also unprecedented propaganda, but this propaganda was kind of homegrown, driven by the government, but they're very much along the lines of Russian propaganda. So Russia and Georgia, the Georgian government, they were promoting the same false narratives. I don't know if you have heard about Global War Party. If not, I would encourage you to Google it, and the first link that you will find is that this is a narrative which the Georgian ruling party, Georgian Dream, came up with. So basically, this Global War Party, it includes the Western politicians from Europe, from United States. Some of the Global War Party representatives might be sitting in this room now. Please identify yourself. But this is the kind of hilarious stories that the government was trying to feed. And plus, they have all the resources, incomparably high resources compared to, I mean, either civil society or the opposition. And then they had this very sophisticated election manipulation scheme in place, which I will expand on that later. So, in reality, there is a lot of Russian influence in Georgia, and that is done through mainly the government, the governing elite, and the ruling party. How this evolves, this is obviously another story, and let's entertain a conversation on that as well. But that very much depends on not only on Georgians, not only on local actors, but also on international community a lot.
Thank you. Iryna, moving on to Ukraine. Obviously, and unfortunately, I would want to say, I cannot ask the same question because elections are not happening in Ukraine as a result of the war and the ongoing existence of the martial law under which holding elections is prohibited. Yet Russia, and I think this is important to point out, is not just waging a conventional war on Ukraine and against Ukrainian, but to paraphrase you, Adrian, is also making use very systematically of this weaponization of anti-democratic measures. Can you maybe help us understand a little bit how Russia is doing this, how this is being played out on a daily basis, and how this has impacted on Ukraine's democratic trajectory over the past 1,001 days?
Yes, thank you very much. I just want to start on this marking this 1,001 day of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but also as a reminder that the war from Russia started against Ukraine in 2014. So we are basically almost soon 4,000 days of Russian aggression against Ukraine. And as you know, that it has had devastating effects on Ukraine, on the number of civilian deaths and casualties, and on energy infrastructure and so on and so forth. So the amount of crimes that Russia has been committed against Ukraine is immense. But as you mentioned, we are, of course, a democracy at war, and we are also the state which is fighting for democracy in this war, because, as you know, the Russian goal is basically to stop Ukraine, to make Ukraine not a free nation, to make Ukraine not a democratic nation, and to basically subjugate it to Russia. And as you rightly pointed out, of course, Russia uses both conventional and non-conventional means, and the amount of it is also quite huge. Basically, Russia weaponizes almost everything that is possible to weaponize. You know, just a small anecdote, if I can say that. Unfortunately, tonight I didn't sleep very well because of the very noisy neighbors who have launched a karaoke party next to my room in the middle of the night. And while I was not sleeping, I was getting all the alerts from Ukraine about the air raids going on and on in Kyiv. And so I didn't sleep because of the noisy neighbors, and my friends and colleagues in Kyiv and all across Ukraine didn't sleep because of the aggressive neighbor next to our doors who was launching drones and missiles almost every single night. So just imagine that basically on a daily basis, people are deprived of sleep for hours and hours. For example, an average air alert in the middle of the night for Kyiv is several hours. But if you take Kharkiv, for example, on a monthly basis, they spend days and days in air alerts. So, and this goes on already soon for the third year. So I could say that even Russia is weaponizing sleep, in this regards. Russia is, of course, weaponizing cold, because we are now entering the cold season, and we know the situation with energy infrastructure is quite difficult, so that would be also a problem. Russia, of course, weaponizes migration. It forces people to leave their homes and move. Russia, of course, for many, many years have weaponized culture and history and so on and so forth. And of course, Russia is using a lot of cyber attacks. I mean, this is a tactic that has been in place since 2014, of course, but it has aggravated since 2022, thousands and thousands of cyber attacks on the governmental portals, on the ministries, on the, also against NGOs, activists, and I mean, it's been ongoing. Energy infrastructure has been also a target of these attacks. Just to kind of provide a few examples, one of the biggest attacks on the energy infrastructure of Ukraine in 2022 in October, it was not only via conventional means, but also via cyber means, and then mobile operators and so on. But just to follow up how democracy survives in this, it is still, showing resilience. The society is showing resilience, and democratic institutions continue to work despite all of these challenges.
Thank you. Thomas, over to you. You are a member of the German Bundestag. In that capacity, you are a member of the EU Affairs Committee of the Parliament. How would you, from your perspective as a German parliamentarian, assess this undermining, this systematic undermining of democratic development in Eastern Europe on the part of Russia? And by extension, do you think, again, from your perspective, that EU member states and Germany, for example, in particular, are doing enough to support Eastern European countries in their fight against this undermining of democratic development?
Good morning, first of all. Actually, we have to realize that we are part of a cyber war that's taking place not only in the countries of the so-called Eastern Partnership of the European Union, but also within our own member states. We see massive influence. We see with the election voters buying, corruption, and as for Moldova, the diaspora voters changed the election result, but to the better, as we see it. In Georgia, they were not allowed to take part on a large scale. So the influence of Russia, the fear of the Russian aggression is very big, and we have to accept that the people looking at the Ukraine and the constant war that is taking place, not only for 1,000 days, as you mentioned, but for more than 10 years when the Crimea was annexed. And we still have nothing to put against the cyber war. Not too long ago, 2 days ago, we seen that a sabotage of data transmission from Central Europe to the Scandinavian countries. We've seen this over the years for many times. We've seen in Germany drones flying across our military bases, and we get the answer by our military. We are not able to bring them down because this could hurt someone being at, and we cannot do something against this. This is ridiculous. And the war of the narratives started with Russia Today many years ago. We had the influence on the British decision on to leave the European Union, the Brexit decision. We know this. We have seen the influence on election days in the United States as well, and the influence for our election will be there as well. And you see, we have data, we have reports that those parties in Germany who have a pro-Russian connotation in their programs, and they are from the extreme right on the one side and from the extreme left on the other side, that they are supported very much by Russia, not only by direct payments and by direct contacts, but also by information that is brought to the social media. And the action plans that were taken by the European Union are there, but they are not effectively working as they should do, as they must do. And therefore, democracy is under pressure. I've not yet been, unfortunately, to Moldova, but I was walking on the street of Rustaveli Avenue the day before Bidzana Ivanishvili held a speech. So I was walking with the pure European demonstrators, and the next day we were listening what he said, what he ordered to the Georgian nightmare, as I say, for many weeks or months. And after the election, on the way to the election and after the election, all these things are fulfilled. So we wanted to believe that Georgia is going its way into the European Union, but the government did something completely different. The European Union asked for 10 subjects to be solved, topics to be solved. The Georgian dream did nothing, and then the topics were reduced to 7. The Georgian dream did nothing, and finally they got, you get a candidate status. If we do not send our stop signals to the government loud enough, and if we do not start to counterattack the cyber war, we will be in trouble over the next month and years as well.
Thank you, Thomas. I think this is a very pertinent point that you just made, that we, as a European Union, I take it, and thus the member states as well, did not clearly transmit a clear-cut, straightforward message towards the government in Tbilisi as to what the holding of unfair and unfree elections will eventually mean. I think that is a very important point. Iryna, I would like to come back to you, and thus the case of Ukraine, and again, maybe move our conversation a little bit more concretely to actual political development on the ground, democratic development. And when we look at Ukraine, we hear kind of mixed signals. On one hand, you have those who say, well, reforms have slowed down, the president has accumulated power over the past 2.5 years, parliament is not really functioning the way it should be functioning, a new oligarchy is being in the making for a post-war situation. The progress report by the European Commission itself even states for most issue areas that very limited or some progress has been made. On the other hand, publicly, politically, we hear messages coming from the member states, coming from Brussels institutions, that Ukraine is doing really well in terms of pursuing democratic reforms. And we also have some very prominent think tanks that confirm these views, looking at various issue areas. What do we make of these somewhat contradictory messages and assessments? Can you tell us a little more?
Yes, so just to kind of, I think I would like to highlight several points that, first of all, of course, there are certain limitations, as you have underlined several times. We are in war situation, martial law inevitably limits certain kind of freedoms, and there has been some criticism towards certain decisions, and you know, the European Commission has highlighted some of those. For example, there is a big debate in Ukraine about this united marathon, so about certain limitations on media, and which, according to the martial law, is basically very legitimate, but of course it raises concern both internally and externally. But on the other hand, it is also true that both the European Commission, but also civil society organizations, they underline that the progress in reforms has not stopped, so that the process is ongoing. Of course, we can argue about what are the evaluations, and there is a big understanding in Ukraine that the speed of those reforms has to go faster, but I think that even the report highlights that there are no setbacks, so that Ukraine is well on track. The other reason about this evaluation, which both Brussels and Kiev underlines, that basically Ukraine has focused a lot of attention on preparations to the screening process, and also to conduct reforms which were needed to launch this Ukraine facility and Ukraine plan and the facility. But just if I may say about some of the things, because I'm also part of the civil society group, and our partners have monitored progress in several domains, including anti-corruption. For example, anti-corruption. Yes, of course, there are a lot of scandals about the corruption, but I think we need to understand that, first of all, Ukraine has developed a strong infrastructure, right? The institutions are in place. Yes, there are small nuances that are in progress, sometimes better, sometimes worse. We monitor them, we highlight them, and the system, sometimes slower, of course, that we want, but they are reacting. And I think the fact that we see all these kind of scandals is also because the civil society pays very close attention, media pays very close attention, which also means the institutions are working. And one of the reforms that I also want to kind of mention here, because of my past that I have spent in the security and defense sector and on the reform, I want to highlight, for example, the defense procurement reforms. I mean, this is existential reform for Ukraine because it makes the procurements in defense area more transparent. Ukraine has established two agencies, one for lethal aid procurement and another for non-lethal aid procurement, and these agencies are working quite successfully. Again, it's not perfect. Of course, there have been some issues raised in that process, but only already with the launch of these agencies, Ukraine have managed to economized on quite a lot of procurements. And now the advisory councils, which consist from both international experts and Ukrainian experts, are launched. So I think this is quite important. But of course, there are challenges. It's not perfect, but I think another few things are important. First of all, I believe there is a political will for the reforms, and it's based on the fact that society demands reform. So among the priorities, of course, the war is #1 priority, but the second priority is reforms.
Adrian, you have two fingers.
I'd like to extrapolate on this, on a phenomenon that is happening right now, is that the countries affected by the war, I mean Ukraine, but also countries affected by the hybrid war, by a massive hybrid war, are still assessed on the reform pace like nothing happens outside the process. While now I think we should look into the analysis of assessing the reform pace and the transformative actions that are happening against also the hybrid warfare that we're facing, the challenges and the attack on the democracy that we're facing. And at this point, just following the rule book as it was conceived during the peace times is no longer sufficient. And I'm very optimistic that EU countries in particular understand this. We see a lot of political understanding among the EU leaders on what is happening, and that there is a significant pace of reform, and there is even better pace of reform if you're looking what the countries are facing in terms of war or hybrid warfare, but it surely needs to get transformed also at a technical level in an understanding how can we support democracy, support the pace of reform, but understanding that the countries like Moldova, Ukraine, are going through an extraordinary situations, war, and the extraordinary means sometimes need to be used to defend democracy and the core democratic elements, and then move on with everything else. So that's the new reality that we're facing, and I am very hopeful that the adaptation of the analysis of the paces of the reforms, of the progresses, will follow and will get this into consideration.
Thank you, Adrian. Giorgi, I would like to bring you back into the conversation and move back to Georgia for a second, and ask more specifically about the extent to which, if at all, of course, the war in and on Ukraine has been exploited, so to speak, by Ivanishvili as the overarching patron and his somewhat replaceable, if you wish, clients in Georgian Dream, to not just roll back political rights and civil liberties, but de facto transform Georgia into what Freedom House nowadays calls a semi-consolidated authoritarian regime. Do you first and foremost agree with this assessment of Freedom House? And secondly, could you maybe very concisely, very briefly give us maybe one or two, maybe three examples of how Georgian Dream does that actually, this process of autocratization of Georgia?
So we kind of found ourselves like a frog being boiled, and it's too late to find out that you're being boiled to jump out. So we noticed the early signs of consolidation of power right from the beginning of ruling party coming to power. But then we all of a sudden found out that all the state institutions are captured by the ruling party, even the branches of power like judiciary is captured. And that is done in a very peculiar way. So basically, Ivanishvili himself, the system that he's built is based on personal loyalty. So as examples, for instance, the current Minister of Interior used to be his bodyguard. The two health ministers used to be the doctors of his family. The Minister of Education would be his son's calculus teacher, and so on and so forth. Even the two prime ministers, so one of them used to be the CEO of his bank, commercial bank, and the second one was his personal assistant. So that's the way how he selected the people based on personal loyalty, and plus to that he was paying all of them the thick bonuses, thick monthly bonuses with envelopes, basically out of any, official accounting. So he created this very corruption and kleptocratic-based system, and obviously he allowed them to enrich themselves, being involved in corruption. And that's also the whole basis of his governance system, and that was the same with the election. So I think I missed the part you asked in the previous question on the numbers or on imagining how much that could, they could have benefited. So obviously there is no formula that can lead you to to finding out what was the excessive amount that this or that mechanism of rigging brought, but we have several, I would say, reference points. One, there have been 2 very reputable exit polls conducted by very reputable companies, US companies, Harris X and Edison Research, and both of them showed around 40 to 42% of the ruling party, whereas the official results gave them 56%. And they, in their written report after the elections, they said that these official results don't make any statistical sense. So it's statistically impossible for the ruling party to get those numbers. Secondly, we've had a couple of years ago, we had a very important whistleblower approaching us who basically laid out the whole scheme of election manipulation in place in Georgia. There was a former part of Ivanishvili's team. He was a very powerful man, deputy head of the state security agency. And he thought that he possessed that much information that he could be invincible, and he was proven wrong because he's in prison now, charged with spreading state secrets. So basically he gave to us the whole scheme of the election manipulation, which is based on the one hand, collecting massive amounts of information on each and every voter. Several million people, they have database of, profiles on each and every person just to identify their vulnerabilities. And then the second part of the scheme is that all the state institutions are being mobilized to work on those pressure points. And that part, and in his own assessment, in their own assessment, this scheme gave them the benefit of anywhere between 8 and 15 percentage points. And then we've seen the violations and riggings on the election day. These were just massive ones. We have been observing all the elections, and this amount of election violations have never been seen in Georgia since 2003. Which were the Shevardnadze's regime back then. So I think if anyone wants to see it, there is plenty of evidence of seeing that the elections have been really rigged. So now with regards to the second question, I'll be very, very quick. So as I said, we've seen this continuous democratic backsliding and consolidation of power, but with the launch of Russian invasion in Ukraine, the second invasion, we've seen all of that accelerated. It was after that that the ruling party started directly going against the West. It was after that that they were personifying different Western politicians and the countries and agencies and calling them basically the enemies of the country, of Georgia, that they wanted to drag Georgia into the war. That was and especially this year, when that famous speech by Ivanishvili, which you referred to, which was basically an eye-opener for many, where he directly and openly named the West as the enemy of the country. So Ukraine does have a tremendous impact on the whole region, on the agents of, not agents like spies, but the Russian agents generally, who are the agents of their influence. And obviously, also a natural solution to those problems and a shortcut is to help Ukraine win this war and do that as much as we can, all of us.
Before I give you the word, Thomas, to bring you into this important conversation, allow me to just very briefly go back to you, Adrian, and pick up on what you said before and maybe link it to what Giorgi just said, the war serving as an accelerator, as far as Georgia is concerned, of the rolling back of democratic achievements. And I put it a bit more provocatively, and I ask you for a very brief answer, if possible, onto this point. Moldova has been exposed in various ways to the fallouts of the war in Ukraine. Have these fallouts resulted or impacted on the pace of reforms? President Sandu herself acknowledged recently, as you know, of course, that I have heard your message, you, the people of Moldova, you have spoken. We have to change something. We have to get better at reforms. Is there a link between the slowing down of the reform pace and the war itself?
In case of Moldova, it was not about slowing down the reforms. It was about the pace that was needed to ensure that people don't get hit so hard because of the war in Ukraine, on the consequences of the incomes, on the welfare, on their well-being. So we had a good pace of reform, a planned pace of reform that we had in mind back in 2021 when entering the parliament and the majority was formed. But then the wave of challenges that came across as a consequences of Russian aggression of Ukraine were of such proportion that even though we followed those reforms and we delivered on them, it was simply no longer enough against the challenges. That's why I'm saying that we need to rethink how we analyze progress, not only against the standard commitments that we have in the context of enlargement or transformation of some institutions, but also against the backdrop of crises that we all faced and the interference and the provocations that we had to face and witnessed in the past years.
From your angle, Thomas, in direct response to this particular point, we have to assess reform in light of the broader context that is the war and its fallouts. How do you assess the perspectives of what used to be the EU3 and at this point is unfortunately the EU2 in terms of membership perspective, in terms of future democratic trajectory?
Actually, if there is one good thing out of the war in the Ukraine, it is that the European Union is rethinking and accelerating our plans to enlarge, which is valid for the Western Balkans, but as well as for the Eastern Partnership. And there are more contacts, there's more work been done, there's more consulting. For Moldova, I think the reforms on democratic values are not the problem, they are done. But we need to have more wealth for the people in the rural areas as well, because wealth and democratic resilience, let it call this way, go hand in hand, go side by side. And if you look at the capital, the results of the elections were okay, but if you go to the rural areas, it's something really different, and the numbers against the European integration and in the referendum, the no votes are going down. So this is something that has to be looked on very carefully, and the European Union has to help on this side as well to focus on investments from Western companies. Moldova has the advantage of being neighbor to Romania, to a member state, and there are many Moldovians who have both passports, so they have the right of traveling throughout Europe, they have the right of working throughout Europe, but we need these young, active generation within the country because they have to change the country from within. For Georgia, the regional situation is different, and if I may add another country on the line, I've been to Armenia 3 weeks ago, and I visited the European observant mission along the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And what real help could we be in a case of war, in a case of attack? How can weapons be brought to this country if you look at the neighboring countries? So the regional situation is also very, very important, what we have to look at. And as you mentioned, the developments of the Georgian gene over the years, it's not half a year or 1 year or 2 years, it's many, many years that free media people were attacked publicly on street, and the state prosecution did nothing. And I think it was 2 years ago we met the Ministry of Culture, who formerly was the Ministry of Justice, and some say she does both jobs still, but she transformed the cultural scene completely. So the heads of the theaters were removed, replaced by Georgian Dream loyalists, and the complete society was changing, always with pressure. And the influence on schools in the rural area, in the main city, those people who got their jobs in the public systems, they were shown very, very hard whom to vote and what would follow if they do not vote.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm particularly grateful to you for having made the point that EU democracy support action, EU member states democracy support action in Eastern Europe needs to be much more tangible, needs to be sustainable, and most of all visible. This is certainly something that I myself, allow me this personal remark, each and every time I travel to the region, see that or do not see, as a matter of fact, even though this is such a low-hanging fruit, if you wish, on the part of the European Union, that it does not really make use of.
Georgia is importing 80% of the food from Turkey, so
yes.
There must be some changes.
It's a good point, exactly. On this very note, I would like to open up the floor and maybe collect a couple of questions and or comments from the audience. A number of hands go up immediately. Please introduce yourself and try to be as concise as is possible. We have 1, 2, and 3 for now. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting debate. I'm Hannes Swoboda, president of the International Institute for Peace and long-term member of the European Parliament. I fully agree with the criticism on Russia, on the Russian aggression. I think it's horrible what is happening, and this multi-war against people, against democracy, against freedom, and so on. My question concretely is, and we discussed it recently also with the ambassador of Moldova in Austria, beyond that, how can you try to integrate in the modern conception of a European democracy those elements of your society who are attracted by the anti-liberal forces or by Russian forces, but are still open-minded? You have it in several regions in Moldova, you have it, of course, also in Ukraine. How to counter this Russian philosophy of we have to fight for the Russian-speaking population. Or I recently also visited Georgia, where you also have people who are on the limbo between following Russian propaganda, but on the other hand, they are for Europe. How to convince them that they have to vote for Europe, not only be for Europe. So I think beyond the Russian attack, we have to concentrate on winning the people for the European cause. Thank you.
Who wants to comment on this one very briefly?
Adrian.
Very
Very briefly on the situation in Moldova, I think three things that we are doing right now and needs to be upscaled, and we will be doing that in the future. First of all, Russian propaganda very much tries to portray a situation of a country divided. Well, there is no antagonization between Romanian-speaking, Russian-speaking, or between different ethnicities. There are really not. I mean, Moldova is a friendly country. People live together in mixed community villages with different, and one thing we need to prevent is this spread out of the narrative that that there is some sort of a division in the society. There is not. Second, we invest a lot in offering everyone an opportunity to learn Romanian language. On the one hand, we have in the first years of piloting a free program for learning Romanian language as an official language of the state, but in the same time, we start doing and we will be upgrading the number of cultural programs to support ethnic minorities, to support the diversity in our society in a cultural, linguistic way. And this is a very important element for cultural cohesion and, again, combating the perception that there is some sort of a division. And third, we need more journalism, more content creators that would speak in the language of those who are afraid or disinformed about what EU integration means. Probably the last one, we need to deliver on the welfare. Because one thing that people who are skeptical about EU integration and that are leaning towards Russian propaganda are the fact that they themselves don't yet see the full benefits of it.
Very briefly, Iryna and Giorgi.
I'll try to very briefly summarize a lot of thoughts that I wanted to share. First, for Ukraine, I mean, the paradox of this war is that Russia basically, the most devastating effects are on the population of the more, let's say, Russian-speaking regions. And I think that it's very clear for those who have seen what is happening on the occupied territories and the amount of all sorts of things, starting from quite poor conditions of life, but also the pressure from Russian state on the population there, and the devastation that Russia brought is showing like really clearly the trajectory for Ukraine, where to go. And then second thing is that, of course, unfortunately, due to war, quite a lot of people have moved somewhere to the West, and they actually, a lot of people who have never traveled abroad, they have seen what it means to live according to the European standards. They have seen that, you know, life in a lot of European countries is much better than you can see what life is in Russia, for example. So they see clearly with their own eyes this difference. And then third thing, I think that Ukraine, over the years of the association agreement, started to benefit quite a lot of this, integration with the European Union. And I think that this tangible, results of cooperation have been quite felt by the population, and that's why, I mean, there is a very high level of, support to the European integration of Ukraine. But of course, more cooperation is needed, and there is right now a lot of like local cooperation between different parts of Europe. Local communities in European states with Ukrainian and so on. So it's going on a lot of levels and should continue and intensify maybe.
Giorgi, you have 30 seconds on this one.
So, I mean, in Georgia, we don't have a problem of people understanding what is Russian and what is European. I mean, 80% of people are pro-European. We understand with our backbones what Russia is and what Russia can bring. So there is no such a problem. The only thing that is kind of sitting doubt in the people is when at certain decisive points, I mean, sorry if I'm too blunt, we don't see an adequate reaction from the West. When we see that the West is buying the non-existing arguments of the ruling party, this is something that discourages people. And we've seen lots of examples of that. So otherwise, we understand that we're kind of at the brink of historic window of opportunity to be closer to the European Union, and we have the government at this historic moment which is undermining all of that.
We have two more questions, and I suggest we take them together. It was the gentleman over there, and there was a third one somewhere, yes, over there in the middle. Please introduce yourself, and be brief.
Thank you very much. My name is Wouter Sveers. I'm with the Klingendaal Institute in the Netherlands. I have a question for Mr. Balutel. I very much agree with your point that the EU should be aware of the difficult context in which reforms have to take place in Moldova, in Ukraine, and in Georgia and the other candidates, given the hybrid war or actual warfare. I just struggle to understand a bit how the EU should operationalize that in its assessments of progress, what you played for. So could you please expand on that a little bit? Should the EU actually lower the criteria? Is that what you're pleading for? Should there be longer timelines, or is it mostly in, well, sort of the conclusions that the EU draws on the basis of the more factual assessments? Thank you.
Thank you. And the third one here in the middle.
Thank you. I'm Anya Petrov from Bulgaria. I work for Dnevnik, which is a Bulgarian news website. It's about Georgia. So we can clearly assume that the elections were rigged, there was large-scale fraud. This is understandable. But was the Georgian opposition up to this historic moment that everyone was talking about? You said 80% in favor of EU, but it seems to me, by reading what happened and talking to experts, that the opposition, if it had united fully, could have changed a bit the outcome of the result. Do you think so?
Thank you very much. Thomas, feel free to come in as well, and Iryna, of course, as well. We have 3 more minutes for basically 2 questions. Adrian, you go first.
I'll be very brief on that. I do believe that the backdrop of challenges should be compensated with more support and more assistance, because you need to get up to the challenge. And the good thing is that now we have the growth plan, which is very ambitious and is very helpful in the current circumstances. And we will need to operationalize this as soon as possible. We are not looking, and we don't want to lower the criteria. On the contrary, we want to get more support on following and fulfilling the criteria. So I think that's the way forward. And that is related in terms of assistance and support, but also that's related on how many resources Commission, EU, member states allocate on understanding the realities and engaging with the countries from Eastern Europe, with Moldova in particular.
Thank you. Giorgi?
Thank you for the question. I mean, to understand the reality in these circumstances of the state capture, of the influences, of the pressure, it's very difficult to remain operational and strong. This concerns the opposition, this concerns the civil society, this concerns even the public. You know, currently the public are disillusioned, public think that we've been won over by the government, and now it's all of our task, our joint task, to really believe in our forces once again, because otherwise we won't be able to win this over. You know, when you are being a subject of smear campaigns, of violent attacks, even physical attacks for years, when you are under-resourced, when the media outlets are on the brink of extinction, and that's what's happening now, it's very difficult to really mobilize people in huge, I would say, in big numbers, but also it's very difficult to try to operationalize and try to plan in a normal democratic way how to do that. But, I mean, we don't have any other choice. Opposition, critical media, civil society, the people of Georgia, we're in the same boat. We just have to win, you know, and we're not looking to outsource this battle to anyone else. We will do our own job, but we need certain very targeted assistance from the West. We need targeted actions against those who perpetrated the election fraud and those who perpetrated the, I would say, the state capture. We need continuous support to really sustain this fight. You know, we need support to the media. We need support to the critical outlets, to the civil society. The rest we're going to do on our own.
Iryna, I go to you first, and then you will have the last word, Thomas.
I mean, not on the questions, because they were quite specific, but I just want to have one, let's say, final sentence about the fact that we are able to basically discuss the democratic developments in these regions because Ukraine still stands, still fights. And I think this is really important to remember, because if Ukraine is not successful, if Ukraine fails, I think democracy will be at risk not only for Ukraine, but for the whole region. So this is, right now, we are facing really quite crucial moment in this fight with the US elections and with changes in Germany and some other countries. And I think Europe has to step up first and foremost, because, I mean, your countries and even the region we are in today could be affected if Russia is successful.
Someone yesterday said, Thomas, and I think it was in the context of the last panel where we had the former Bulgarian Minister of Environment, and I think it was the moderator, he said, you are used to power, so now you have the power of transmitting the final message in a very short and concise way.
10 seconds.
As the clock is ticking.
10 seconds left, but I think we have just 2 or 3 thoughts. For Moldova, we have to do everything to have the economic growth, to help the reforms, to bring it even closer to the European Union. For Georgia, we have to look very carefully on the developments that are even worse day by day, and have to, as international community, have to show the Georgian dream a stop signal of cooperation when they do not fulfill the will of the people. And the opposition was as united as it ever could be. It never had been more united than it was in this time. And in other Western Balkan states, we have to look whether we have equal, similar tendencies of state capture carried through. We do not have to look too far from this place on developments that are worrying. But above all, we have the Ukraine war, and the international states have to deliver what is needed to enable the Ukraine to regain their sovereignty over their state. And Germany is always discussing, and we are not delivering what we can and what we should. That is Taurus. I'm very glad that at least the United States allowed the Ukraine to use the long-range missiles for what they are meant to be. If we do not cut the supply lines on the Russian grounds, the situation for the Ukraine will get worse and worse. And we've seen it. You talked of the winter which is coming, and the complete year, the energy supply, the supply with warm heating, with heating was destroyed intentionally step by step. And we allowed this by not giving enough, by giving too late weapons, and not allowing the Ukraine to use the weapons for what they were meant to be.
Thank you, Thomas. You used your power as the last speaker very poignantly, so kudos to that. 4 key takeaways I think that we can take with us from this conversation at least. 1, democratic development in Eastern Europe continues to be extremely, extremely fragile. It continues to be, 2, under threat on a daily basis as we speak, beyond conventional warfare on the part of Russia. 3, EU democracy, EU member states democracy support needs to be much more context-specific, much more tangible and sustained. And 4, going back to what Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya said in her introductory remarks, democracy and security cannot be separated from one another. Without democracy, there cannot be any lasting security. I thank our 4 speakers. I thank you for your questions and for listening in. Thank you.